The Theology of Christian Perfection, Part 18. Active purification of the intellect. With the active purification of the external and internal senses, and of the sensitive appetite, one will have taken a great step towards Christian perfection. But it is necessary that the purification reach into the very depths of one's spirit to rectify the deviations of intellect and will. When the passive purification will complete what a man cannot do by his own efforts, with the assistance of ordinary grace. According to traditional psychology, there are two spiritual faculties of the soul, the intellect and the will. Some authors, and especially the ancient mystical writers, considered the intellectual memory to be a third faculty of the soul, distinct from the other two. But in reality it is merely a function of the intellect, which preserves intellectual species. Only as an internal sense, the sensitive memory, it is an autonomous faculty distinct from the other internal senses and from the intellectual memory. The purification of the intellectual memory follows a process which is analogous to the purification of the sensitive memory, of which we have already spoken. Therefore, we shall speak of the active purification of the two faculties of the soul, which are really distinct, the intellect and the will. The intellect is the faculty of the soul by which we apprehend things in an immaterial way. Its proper effect is the idea which abstracts from external objects by means of the phantasm of the imagination, which is illumined by the abstractive power of the intellect itself, called in psychology the agent intellect. Intellectual knowledge is completely distinct and infinitely superior to the knowledge of the senses. Sensitive knowledge always refers to single, concrete, and determined objects, while the knowledge through ideas, the object of intellectual knowledge, is always universal, abstract, and undetermined. We possess sensitive knowledge in common with the animals, but intellectual knowledge is proper and exclusive to intellectual beings, God, the angels, and man. When the intellect compares two ideas and affirms or denies something about them, it pronounces a judgment. If it compares two judgments in order to conclude a third judgment, it performs an act of reasoning. Explicit reasoning, in the form which we have given, is called a syllogism. It is well to note that our intellect functions in such a way that we can never have two thoughts at the same time. If we are occupied in some thought, it will be impossible for us at the same time to be conscious of another distinct thought. This phenomena is the basis of the attention, which is nothing other than the application of the mind to a subject. The custody of the senses, silence and tranquility, are a great help to the fostering of attention and the preservation of attention over a long period of time. For that reason, these things will have great importance in practice. When the intellect compares two ideas and affirms or denies something about them, it pronounces a judgment. If it compares two judgments in order to conclude a third judgment, it performs an act of reasoning. Explicit reasoning, in the form which we have just given, is called a syllogism. It is well to note that our intellectual functions in such a way that we can never have two thoughts at the same time. If we are occupied in some thought, it will be impossible for us at the same time to be conscious of another distinct thought. This phenomenon is the basis of the attention, which is nothing other than the application of the mind to a subject. The custody of the senses, silence and tranquility of spirit, are a great help to the fostering of attention and the preservation of attention over a long period of time. For that reason, these things have great importance in practice. The intellect is very delicate and subtle in discovering almost without a multitude of aspects surrounding an idea. It is profound in analyzing and dividing into its ultimate elements some concrete notion. It is solid if it is able to reason things out by logical deduction based upon a certain principle. It has foresight. From the past events or present events, it can deduce by means of an acute observation what will happen in the future. In spite of the simplicity of the intellect as a spiritual faculty, mystical theologians, in order to explain phenomena which would be difficult to understand, have established certain divisions or distinctions regarding an intellectual function of the soul. The principal distinctions or divisions are the following. 1. What the mystical authors refer to as the mind, mens, is the most spiritual and elevated part of the soul, in which disturbances of the physical world can never reach. Illumined by God, it always reflects his divine splendors and is far removed from the earth. In the midst of the most painful trials and darkness, this superior part of the spirit remains tranquil, as if it were already in eternity. It is also called by some authors the supreme heaven, or the light of understanding. 2. What the authors call reason is further subdivided into the superior reason and the inferior reason. The superior reason always obtains its conclusions from the principles of pure understanding, that is, without any influence of the passions. It is called the middle heaven, and it always tends upward to that which is noble and elevated. The inferior part of the soul, on the other hand, judges by means of the experience of the senses and under the influence of the passions, and for that reason it tends downward to that which is useful or delightful for the subject. It is the lowest heaven, and is often closer to earth than it is to heaven. This consists in the removal of the obstacles or evil inclinations, which are the result of original sin and our own personal sin, which are opposed to perfect submission to of the intellect to God. The principal obstacles are the following. Useless thoughts. Our spirit is frequently occupied with a multitude of useless thoughts, which cause us to waste time and divert our attention to that which is base or perishable, with the result that we pay no heed to those things which are of great interest and value to the soul in its sanctification. We should not forget that the intellect cannot be occupied at the same time with two distinct thoughts. One of the two will always be considered the prejudice of the other. The majority of the distraction, which we lament during prayer and the other exercises of piety, proceed from the fact that we have previously wasted time in useless thought. The spirit cannot pass directly from one situation to another which is completely distinct. It needs time to react and adapt itself to the new occupation. For that reason, it is necessary to combat useless thoughts with great energy and to reject anything that may dissipate the intellect by distracting it or withdrawing it from the great task of one's sanctification. It is necessary to renounce, as much as possible, the reading of useless books, or indulging in frivolous conversations which fill our soul with useless thoughts. The reading of magazines and newspapers should also be curtailed. All of this is inconvenient, but it is precisely because they do not wish to suffer these deprivations that many who aspire to Christian perfection remain only halfway on the road to sanctity. Ignorance. It is one thing to feed upon useless thoughts, and it is something very different to welcome or encourage ignorance, lest one lose his tranquillity. This would be a grave error, and perhaps more harmful than useless thoughts. Not every kind of ignorance is voluntary, and not every kind of ignorance is sin. All the Christians are not obliged to acquire a professional knowledge of theology, but certainly all are obliged to obtain that knowledge which is, according to their ability and the obligation of their state in life, can contribute to their intellectual and moral perfection. A dislike or hatred of knowledge has always been a sign of an evil spirit, and has been the origin of many heresies in the Church. Sacred Scripture reproves this attitude in no uncertain terms, and St. Paul frequently insists on the utility of knowledge for the service of God. Nevertheless, not all knowledge is useful or convenient for one's sanctification. St. Paul speaks of the knowledge which puffs up, in distinction to charity, which edifies, 1 Corinthians 8:1. In the acquisition of knowledge one can sin in two ways. One, as regards the one who studies, by not following the impulse of the virtue of studiosity, but studying out of curiosity, vanity, or the mere pleasure which one experiences in study. 2. As regards that which is studied, when it is harmful to the soul or utterly useless. It is especially necessary to combat ignorance in matters of religion and the spiritual life. It is certain that with the right intention we can and ought to study human sciences, and especially those which pertain to one's profession and duties of state, but above all we should apply ourselves to the science of our eternal salvation. It would be an absurdity to dedicate all our efforts to human science and neglect that supreme science which concerns our eternal destiny. Such is the sad spectacle of many persons who are eminent in literary culture, in art or science, but lack the most fundamental knowledge of religion. Others dedicate themselves weakly to the acquisition of sacred science, but with an attitude that is opposed to study. They are interested only in the speculative knowledge of truth, but are not concerned with letting that knowledge affect their lives. Such souls are dying of spiritual anemia without even realizing that they have before their eyes a splendid table at which they can be nourished with holy doctrine. Even though this is not bad, as some who neglect completely the practice of prayer, to dedicate their time to the external works of the apostolate. Such persons should recall the teachings of St. John the Cross, who says that a great deal more profit would be done for the Church, and it would be much more pleasing to God, if such souls would take half of that time spent in activity and devote it to prayer. The soul should therefore dedicate itself to the study of truth, put aside the spirit of curiosity, and seek in this knowledge only the greater glory of God, the dissipation of its own ignorance, and the meaning of advancing along the way to sanctity. Curiosity, in direct opposition to the virtue of studiosity, is the vice of curiosity. This is an immoderate desire to know that which does not pertain to us, or which could be harmful to us. Unfortunately, the sin is committed frequently, either in the acquisition of all types of useless knowledge, or in the knowledge of those things which could only serve to give delight to the senses, or arouse the senses. Under this heading belongs the unrestrained tendency to read every type of novel or book simply to pass the time or for recreation, as well as the insatiable desire for spectacles, such as the theater or sports, which are sometimes truly dangerous or opposed to Christian morality. St. Thomas points out that the attendance of such things is vicious, if it inclines a person to vice or lust or cruelty, because of the things that are presented there. It is impossible that persons who dedicate themselves to such things, especially if it happens with frequency, can keep their soul in the state of spiritual peace and tranquility which is necessary for attaining sanctity. It is also an effect of the vice of curiosity to be constantly prying into the lives and sayings of others in order to find material for criticism and murmuring. St. John of the Cross severely condemns this vice, which is very common among devout persons. He advises souls that are accustomed to meddle in the lives of others that, if they do not correct this evil habit, they will never reach sanctity, but will fall back into a worse state. In order to observe the first of these, resignation, he must live in the monastery as if no other person lived there, and hence he should never meddle, either in word or in thought, with things that happen in the community, nor with those individuals, nor should he take any note of anything concerning them, whether good or evil, nor of their personal qualities. And even if the world came to an end, he would neither remark upon them nor meddle with them, in order to preserve his tranquility of soul, remembering Lot's wife, who, because she turned her head at the cries and noise of those who were perishing, was turned into a hard stone. This the religious must observe scrupulously, and he will thus free himself of many sins and imperfections, will preserve his tranquility and peace of soul, and will make great progress in the sight of God and men. Let great attention be paid to this, for it is of such importance that many religions, by not observing it, have not only never profited by other works of virtue and religion which they have performed, but have continually fallen away, and have gone from bad to worse. However, it is not always forbidden to be concerned with the lives of others. Sometimes it is of obligation, especially for those who are charged by their office to correct their neighbor, as parents and lawful superiors. But this must always be done for a holy and lofty purpose, either to be edified by the good example of others and encouraged to improve one's life, or for the spiritual good of one's neighbor by correcting his defects according to the order of charity and the duty of one's office, but never merely to criticize or to murmur about one's neighbors without any reason or benefit to anybody. Another type of curiosity, which is worse than the preceding, would be to wish to verify by means that are absolutely disproportionate, by divination, magic, spiritism, etc., things that are hidden, such as the secrets of hearts or the future. If one should wish to verify some event by a supernatural means, such as interrogating God, this would constitute the sin of tempting God, which is directly opposed to the virtue of religion. St. John of the Cross insists strongly on the absolute necessity of renouncing every kind of knowledge which could acquire by supernatural means, visions, revelations, prophecies, etc., under pain of never arriving at the nudity of pure faith, which is only means proportionate to the union of our intellect with God. Spiritual directors who, under any pretext, however reasonable it may seem, encourage souls to this type of desire, fall into great error, which they will have to give a strict account to God. Precipitation. Another great defect of the intellect is precipitation, one of the forms of the sin of imprudence. St. Thomas points out why it is evil by setting up a comparison with the natural order. If we descend by leaps down the stairs without touching each step, we act with precipitation. In the manner in the spiritual order holds a superior place, and the action or external work holds the lowest place. One must descend to a decision in orderly fashion by intermediate steps: memory of the past, knowledge of the present, sagacity in the consideration of possible eventualities, reason comparing one with another, and docility in accepting advice from others. If we omit or ignore these steps and immediately launch into a work or make judgment without reflection, we shall have worked or acted with precipitation and imprudence. There are other defects which are intimately connected with this, and which it is necessary to correct. Inconsideration judges without reflecting, without considering the state of the question, without taking account of the elements of judgment, and thereby running the risk of false or incomplete judgments, which give rise to the multitude of illusions and disappointments. Inconstancy, although it has its root in the will, finds its consummation in the intellect, which does not know how to follow the rules which have been given for working rightly, but lets itself be carried away by the caprice of passion. In order to combat these defects, it is necessary to get into the habit of proceeding calmly and with reflection, avoiding lightness and precipitation in our judgments, and inconstancy and volubility in our manner of thinking, which denote a lack of firmness in our grasp of the principles and norms of action. We should never act without reflecting carefully and without weighing in the balance of discretion the pros and cons of all things in the eyes of God. Attachment to one's own judgment. This is one of the forms of pride from which scarcely anyone is completely exempt. It is a most acute form. It reaches the point of subjecting to one's own judgment and dogmas of faith and the decisions of lawful superiors. Even if it does not reach the extreme, it foments and preserves the spirit of division, not in the noble sense of serene exposition and a reasonable defense of some determined school or tendency which seems to possess the truth, but on the basis of mortifying the adversary by treating with disdain and irony those opinions which are contrary to our own. There are few souls who love and serve truth above all, and whose judgments of the opinions of others are not influenced by the satisfaction of self-love and by triumph of their own ideas, without any more reason than the fact that they are one's own ideas or teaching of the school which one belongs. Such people forget that in those questions which God has left open and subject to the discussions of men, there is no philosophical or theological school that could claim that it possesses the entire truth of the exclusion of all other schools. Almost always there is to be found in the contrary opinion some part of the truth which has not been regarded sufficiently because of the prejudices with which it was examined. Intellectual sincerity, the love of truth, humility and charity urge that we listen with attention and impartiality to our opponents, and that we readily grant whatever truth is to be found in their affirmations. In private conduct it is also necessary frequently to renounce one's own judgment and to accept that of others. St. Thomas says that since prudence regards particular and concrete things to be realized, which are almost infinite in number, it is not possible for one man alone to examine all the aspects which must be taken into account in each of these things in order to know what he should do or not do. For that reason, as regards prudence, we need to be informed and taught by others, especially by those who are older and whose experience has taught them many things which escape the precipitous and unreflective knowledge of the young. Up to now we have examined the negative aspect of the purification of the intellect, or the defects which one must combat in order to destroy them completely. The positive aspect can be reduced to one point, which is of capital importance to the Christian life. The soul must let itself be led exclusively by the light of faith, which is the only proximate and proportionate means for the union of the intellect with God in his life. No one has expounded the principle so forcefully as St. John of the Cross. He repeats it unceasingly in all of his works, and he demonstrates it in a masterly fashion with all rigor and exactitude. The following are fundamental points in his argumentation. 1. He begins by positing the infinite transcendence and incomprehensibility of God. The human intellect cannot comprehend the divine being. Before we treat of the proper and accommodated means for union with God, which is faithful, it is fitting that we prove that no creative thing nor imagined thing can serve the intellect as a proper medium for uniting itself with God, and that everything the intellect can attain rather serves as an impediment than a means. 2. Every proximate means must have a proximate and proportionate relation to its end. Therefore, it is indispensable for the union of the intellect with God to find some proximate and proportionate means which is related to him. It is therefore necessary to know that, according to the first rule of philosophy, all the means must be proportionate to the end. That is to say, that they must have some convenience and likeness to the end, so that it will be sufficient for them to attain the end which is desired. Whence it follows that for the intellect to be united with God in this life, as much as is possible, it must necessarily take that means which unites with him and has a likeness to him. 3. No corporal or spiritual creature has any proximate likeness to the infinite being of God. Therefore, none of these things can serve the intellect as a proximate means for the divine union. Among all creatures, the highest or the lowest, there is none that comes near to God or bears any resemblance to his level of being. For although it is true, as theologians say, that all creatures have a certain relation to God and bear a divine impress, some more and others less, according to the greater or lesser excellence of their nature, yet there is no essential resemblance or connection between them and God. On the contrary, the distance between their being and his divine being is infinite. Hence it is impossible for the understanding to attain to God by means of creatures, whether these be celestial or earthly, because there is no proportion or resemblance between them. 4. Since existing creatures cannot serve as a proximate means of the union of the intellect with God, how can creations of the fantasy or the imaginary do so? They are even less able, because the concepts or images of the imagination have less real entity than those which are known through the external senses. The reason for this is that the imagination cannot fashion or imagine anything whatever beyond that which it has experienced through the external senses, namely, that which is seen with the eyes, heard with the ears, etc. At most it can only compose likenesses of those things which has seen or heard or felt, which are of no more consequence than those which have been received. At most it can only compose the likeness of those things which it has seen or heard or felt, which are of no more consequence than those which have been received by the aforementioned senses, nor are they even of as much consequence. Whatever beyond that which it has experienced through the external senses, namely, that which it has seen with the eyes, heard with the ears, etc. At most it can only compose likenesses of those things which it has seen or heard or felt, which are of no more consequence than those which have been received by the aforementioned senses, nor are they even of as much consequence. For although a man imagines palaces of pearls and mountains of gold, because he has seen gold and pearls, all this is, in truth, less than the essence of a little gold or a single pearl, although in the imagination it be greater in quantity and in beauty. And since it has already been said, no creative thing can bear proportion to the beings of God, it means that nothing that is imagined in their likeness can bear any proportion to the being of God. It follows that nothing that is imagined in their likeness can serve as proximate means to union with him, but, as we say, quite the contrary. 5. In passing beyond the world of reality and the world of imagination, will pure ideas serve as means of union of our intellect with God? Neither can they serve, because all of them are restricted within the limits of an intelligible species, which is abstracted from the data of the senses, and God cannot be restricted by any limits whatever. Just so, all that the imagination can imagine and the intellect can receive and understand in this life is not, nor can it be, a proximate means of the union with God. For if we speak of natural things, since the intellect can understand nothing but that which is contained within and comes under the categories of forms and imaging of things that are received through the bodily senses, which we can have said cannot serve as means, though it makes no use of natural intelligence. 6. There still remains in the supernatural world In this way, or through it, one of the three things can come to the intellect, either the clear vision of God, or a clear awareness of Him, which is particular and distinct, or an obscure awareness which is general and distinct. The first is not proper to this life, but to the life to come, for it constitutes the beatific vision. The second, visions, revelations, locutions, and spiritual sentiments, cannot serve as a means or medium because the wisdom of God with which the intellect must be united has no mode or manner and is not contained within any particular or distinct kind of intelligence because it was completely pure and simple. There remains only the supernatural awareness of God, which is obscure, general, and indistinct, which is basically that which is given to us by faith. For that reason, only faith can serve as the proximate and proportionate means for the union of our intellect with God in this life. From what has been said, it is to be inferred that, in order that the intellect be prepared for this divine union, must be pure and void of all that pertains to sense, and detached and freed from all that can be clearly apprehended by the intellect, profoundly hushed and put to silence, and leaning upon faith, which alone is the proximate and proportionate means whereby the soul is united with God. For such is the likeness between itself and God that there is no other difference save that which exists between seeing God and believing in Him. For even as God is infinite, so faith sets Him before us as infinite. And if He is three in one, set Him before us as three in one. And as God is darkness to our intellect, even so does faith likewise blind and dazzle our intellect. Thus by means alone God manifests Himself to the soul in divine light, which surpasses all understanding. Therefore, the greater the faith of the soul, the more closely it is united with God. Therefore, the soul must travel in pure faith if it wishes to arrive at the perfect purification of the intellect and be intimately united with God. St. Thomas had already demonstrated that the purification of the heart is an effect of faith. The reason given by the angelic doctor is that the impurity of a thing itself, in the fact that it is mixed with things that are more base than itself. Now, it is evident that the rational creature is more worthy and has a greater dignity than all temporal and bodily creatures. It is, therefore, made impure if it is subjected to these things through love, and purified of this impurity by the contrary motive, that is, when it tends to that which is above itself, which is God. And in this tendency to God, the first movement comes through faith. By the same token, the first principle of the purification of the heart is faith, which is consummated and perfected by supernatural charity. It does not matter that faith is necessarily of things that are not even seen, and that it is, therefore, essentially obscure and indistinct. It is precisely because of this fact that faith can give us the only knowledge that is possible concerning the intimate life of God, because in this life it is not possible to have a clear and distinct knowledge of those things due to the infinite transcendence of God, who cannot be expressed in any created intelligible species. The clear knowledge of God pertains strictly to the beatific vision. In heaven we shall see God as He is. 1 John 3:2. without any created species, but with our intellect directly united to the divine essence. Nevertheless, even in this world, faith enables us to attain in some way the unfathomable mystery of the infinite life of God, although it be a dark and obscure knowledge. For that reason, the knowledge of faith is of itself immeasurably superior to all sensible and intellectual evidence which we could have of God in this life. In spite of this inevitable obscurity, faith illumines the soul and fills it with the splendors of heaven. The entire preoccupation of the soul must, therefore, consist in making the light of faith inform one's whole life with greater intensity and in a more perfect manner. It is necessary to contemplate all things through faith. One's life, the life of one's family and friends, the happy or unfortunate circumstances or events of life, etc. It is necessary to reach the point where one can, so to speak, lose the human vision of things and replace it with a certain divine instinct proceeding from the gifts of the Holy Ghost, with the clarity of faith. The only way in which one can see all things from the point of view of God, to contemplate all things in this manner, is equivalent to contemplating them, and in a certain way, as God himself contemplates them. Purification of the will. The will, also called the rational appetite, is the faculty by which we seek the good as known by the intellect. It is distinguished from the sensitive appetite, which instinctively seeks the good as known by the senses, ignoring the proper reason of goodness as such. Even the animals possess a sensitive appetite, but the rational appetite is proper to intellectual beings. The proper object of the will is the good proposed by it by the intellect, but in the appreciation or evaluation of the good error may creep in. The intellect can judge as a true God something which is only an apparent good, and the will, which is a blind faculty and always follows the apprehension of the intellect, will be impelled towards the object, which is itself taken as if it were a true good. This is the explanation of sin. The will seeks as a good that which in reality is evil. Every sin is consummated in the will by one's free choice, but it is rooted in the error of the intellect, which has taken as a real good for which was only good apparently, such as the pleasure attached to the sin. For that reason the blessed are intrinsically impeccable, because their intellect, completely occupied with the infinite truth which they contemplate, cannot fall into the slightest error, and their will, completely satiated with the infinite good which they enjoy, cannot enjoy anything apart from that good. Hence sin is intrinsically impossible for the blessed. The proper act of the will is love, or the effective union of the will with a known good. All the movements or partial aspects of the human acts which take place in their will, such as simple volition, efficacious tendencies, consent, election of means, active use of the faculties and fruition, proceed from love or a consequent of love. Love can be divided into many ways. The principal division of our purposes is the following. By reason of the object, love can be sensual or spiritual. By the reason of the end, love can be natural or supernatural. By reason of the former object or motive, love can be natural or supernatural. By reason of the formal object and motive, Love can be a love of concupiscence, of benevolence, or a friendship. It is called a love of concupiscence when one desires the good so far as it is good for oneself, an egotistic motive. It is the love of benevolence if one loves another precisely as far as the other is good and lovable, a most perfect and completely disinterested motive. It is the love of friendship if one loves his friend, not only because he is good in himself, but also because he on his part returns one's love, an intermediate love between the two. Thus the sensual man loves with a love the concupiscence, the object which will give him pleasure. The blessed in heaven habitually love God with a love of benevolence, taking complacence in his infinite perfection, and rejoicing that God is infinitely happy in himself. And the blessed in heaven and the man sanctified by grace here on earth love God with a love of friendship under the impulse of the virtue of charity.